going to do. I mean, obviously, I think I was going to talk for just a few minutes through the kind of this workshop portion tonight a little bit about the concept of introductions. And then I think, Carson, the plan was for you, were you going to go through manuscript plans and for a bit? Was that the plan, or what was the?
Yeah, just kind of like go over them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll share my screen and go through this a little bit. The idea here is basically for the next 3 sessions, I'm going to walk you through basically the core 7 elements of doing your introduction. So basically, I'll do a high level of some of these things and that, because like effectively in your manuscript plan, the idea of what you're going to be submitting is, a first draft set of chapters and a draft introduction. What I wind up spending probably, I'd say like 40 to 50% of my time on with every single author is actually revising their introduction. It just requires work. But if you give a lot of the right core elements, we can make it great. The introduction is one of the things that is like, it's important. It sets the tone for things. It makes sure you really communicate what you want very well. So let me walk you through this, like kind of a few things on introductions here. And I'm going to walk through it sort of fast. And then what we're going to do is like cover a couple components tonight. So what I'd like you guys to do over the next 3 weeks is basically there's these 7 components. Each of the next 3 weeks basically will sort of like do some bullet pointing of things. And then when you write your introduction, you'll have all the bullet points you sort of need. So anyway, the introduction is the beginning, right? And the idea here, it's the interesting thing to know is that why I spend so much time on the introduction is just its importance. So if you they surveyed a whole bunch of readers, what they look for when they buy. And these are the things that mattered. Number 1, why do they buy your book? The title of the book, the cover of the book, the back cover copy, like the book's description copy, the flap copy or reviews if it's online, the author bio, and then the book text itself, right? Which is sort of crazy to think, right? That it like, the book itself is number 6 on the list of why someone buys it. Now, obviously, you still have to write the book, right? We have to make sure it's good, but it is interesting to know that that's sort of that case. So remember, the book content is going to be really important, and sometimes it actually will be more important as a marketing tool outside of the book itself. So we'll use the content. Even some people are like, well, if that not that many people are going to read my book, does it matter? Well, it actually will matter. And we'll show you one of the things we'll be helping you do a lot is using your content to create marketing content. And I think it's interesting to see. We actually will help all of you put together basically a 10-part blog series where you'll extract key content from your book and share it out there in excerpts. So your book itself is, I say it this way, having a book is the reason that more people will listen to you and take you seriously. So the book itself needs to be good, but we're also going to make sure that like just because someone doesn't read your book doesn't mean they won't know what it is. All right. So it's crazy though to think that your book is the 6th reason people do it. Now, what matters within the book text itself? Well, it turns out that the first chapter, your introduction, your preface, your prologue, or the first chapter really is the thing that matters because that's what people are going to read. They're going to read it first and decide what this is good. From there, then they're going to read like the very start of the chapters, these things called hooks. And then from there, the chapters in order. So that's why I spend a lot of time on the introduction because it is important and formulaic. So we're going to spend some time today over the next 3 weeks kind of writing out the bullet points that matter within your introduction or preface. Now, some people ask me, Eric, does it matter if it's my introduction, my preface, my prologue, my first chapter? It doesn't particularly matter. Some people will call it, the prologue, other people call it introduction. It's all the same, whatever they want to do. So the start of this one, right? Great intros really do 2 big things. Number 1, they show, don't tell. They're designed to sort of tell a set of core stories and principles, just like a journalist would do, to really unpack the why behind this book. And they set up everything else. They're sort of a little bit like a trailer to a movie on one extreme. So they're going to basically help you really like get people excited about it. This is the document that you're going to send out to people in the beginning days of it. This is the things you're going to put on your book starter page. Like you want people to know this is a thing. So we're going to invest a lot in it. And again, I'll invest several hours in everyone's introduction, just so you know, like that's kind of because it's that critically important. But to make it possible, there's some elements that we're going to need to do. So here are the sort of 7 core elements of introduction. So where did this come from? Well, as you saw with, the thing that we've done before, right, with all the book, the chapter templates, I went and analyzed a whole bunch of intros, plus intros that have been written, and realized that basically good intros or prologue have all of these 7 elements. Now, they may not always be exactly in this order, and they may sometimes be shorter or longer, but they have these 7 elements. These are the core things. The story or the hook. There's always something that's a grabbing component at the very beginning. And as you're looking at some of the books you're thinking about using, Peyton and I were going back and forth this weekend talking about Malcolm Gladwell. the very first story, the introduction, is something like captures you. It really does grab you in that way. So that's the story, the hook. The current state, we'll talk more about this one, but basically this is the place where you say, the world looks like this today. And it sort of sets the stage of what is the world that you're exploring together. The problem really is to say, like, but what's wrong with that? And why is it wrong, and why did it compel you to write? Why are you the one to write it? Why should you be the one to do this one? What is sort of your theory in terms of the world looks, that needs this book? And then who's the right one to read this? And then kind of the reading behind it. So I'm going to go through a few of these tonight with these ones, and we'll kind of like stop you guys to do some pieces in these ways. So I'm going to skip the hook in this one. We're going to come back to this one last, but we're going to basically talk right now about the concept of the current state. So the current state really is this idea to sort of set the stage for everyone to know what's going on. That's kind of the core thing behind it. And so that's really where these pieces are going to come together. So today I'm going to kind of talk about the current state and the problem. These are the two that we're going to do in this case. So the current state really is this idea of what's the popular consensus? Everyone believes blank, right? And so I'm going to, sort of pick on Carson a little bit, right? One of the things that in his original sort of pitch was everyone believes that you need to drop out of college in order to become a startup founder, right? That's sort of this thing. And so he can talk about all these sorts of things in it, all this sort of stuff, like everyone believes all these sorts of things. Here's the data, the stats, all this sort of stuff. What does the world look like that he's tackling? Now, part of this is to be able to sort of paint that picture clearly. So let me give you a few examples. Current state is things like in this case. And so this is an example of from a book called 10 Ways Up. And this was a book by Catherine Shortsleeve where she was looking at the state of women going on to become CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And so she provides data on this. So she's talking about it right now. Like basically that the number of female CEOs increased 50%, but really like it shows only 27 out of the Fortune 500 companies were female CEOs, right? That's a crazy stat. So she's laying out all these stats and data on what does the world look like today. Right? And that's kind of what she's doing. Here's another example of this one. This is one that's talking a little bit about, this is Cody's book about kind of from Boots to the Boardroom, it's called, about how veterans can transition into successful careers. And he talks about, this concept of like, what does the lifestyle look like for an enlisted person, not an officer who goes to college, but enlisted in the military. And he lays out what does the world look like for them. Another example in this case is, this is a book called The Art of Napping from a guy named Franklin. And he makes the case that we need to nap more. And it's really like a critical point for our world that we actually need to encourage napping at work, which sounds like awesome, doesn't it? But he basically lays some statistics out here saying like, look at the following statistics. Every year the U.S. loses $411 billion in sleep. Here's all the stats behind it. So these sorts of things. And then here's another one example here from a book called A Revolutionary Connectivity by Divine Matoni, where she makes the case that the internet is the most important human right today. And she makes these arguments kind of in the context of like what's going on in the world about Arab Spring and Syrian crisis and Venezuelan civil war, how the internet was so critical in those ones happening. So that's really what the current state is.
Quick question before we move on to that. Can the current state also be like the current mindset of the people? Like in Malcolm Gladwell, it's the vision of success in Outliers and how we think of success. And then
so that's the version of it, right? Like the current state is just to paint the world as it is, right? It's not to basically change what it should be. But this is, again, this popular consensus is the world looks like blank right now is what it is. So we'll talk about the next piece of it in a second here, the problem or why you're writing this one. So here's what I want you guys to do a little bit. I want you to spend some time kind of laying out, if you were to basically set the stage before you can basically sit down with someone and sort of tell them all the stuff in your book, what are some of the core things they need to know in stats? So spend a minute and open up a document in Quip, call your introduction document. We're going to be going and populating this over the next few weeks. But I want you to write, number 2, current state, and I want you to write like some bullet points under these. The popular consensus, the theory going on in the world, right? What's the way this is? Write that one down. So for Ferris, for example, we were talking about his book is about art and refugees and saying like, maybe the current state says that countries need to spend more money to help, with housing and stuff like that. That's what is the current way that we're sort of approaching the problem or, the current approach to the world as you see it right now. So what are the data, the statistics, all those sorts of things? What does the world look like now? So go ahead and spend some minutes. This is one of those things that oftentimes you can find some of these answers when you Google around a little bit. Maybe a good article has some of these pieces here, but what are some of those pieces right there? So just take the next 2, 3, 4 minutes on this of what is the current state of the world related to your book topic. And again, I almost think of this like, in order to really like understand the enormity of this or understand the importance of this or understand whatever it is I think that like we need you to understand these core things. So Peyton, what do we need to understand about the current state of agriculture, right? To basically be able to understand this book. Julie, what do we need to understand the current state of vulnerability? Like what does the world look like? There's a woman named, and again, I'm just going to keep talking as you guys are doing this one. There's a woman working on a book about loneliness. And she talks about the stats out there on loneliness that we have fewer close friends. Women in particular struggle with this one. Depression rates have gone up. All those sorts of things like, are important to sort of know that these things are out there. So it's, again, setting the stage for what does the world look like right now, the current state of the world that is important for people to understand related to your book. And again, for now, you're just going out and, pulling out key quotes, expert feedbacks, books, things that you like, to just a list of things that are important that you could use to write a lot of this. Most of this stuff will likely come from basic internet research or things that you see in key articles. But it's, again, sort of setting the stage so people can understand the general view of what is this sort of the world right now that you're going to be proposing something sort of a little unique. Again, different ways you see this just looking at the statistics of loss of productivity due to poor sleep habits, some specifics of looking at one particular demographic and what its struggles are, again, some historical events that are important to lay out that in the current state, or, again, this one has a whole bunch of stats about female CEOs, multiple paragraphs of it to understand the data on it, what it is.
So, quick question. Since each chapter kind of is focusing on a different aspect of your big idea or whatever it is you're talking about, would you want to talk about the current state of each subject you're talking about? Like, for example, for me, I'm writing a chapter on, public perception of food. So I would talk about the current state of how food is perceived and maybe, the current movements that are going on in food right now.
So you need to abstract up a level, right? Like there's a broader point of your book that's going on, which is, I think, the future of food, right? That's kind of what you're thinking about. So this is about understand the landscape of food more generally. Right now we spend $7 trillion. There's this much hunger in the world. There's this, you want to be careful about trying to this is where you paint the big picture idea of this, what is this hunkin' big thing here? So abstract to the sort of highest level of those pieces. And again, generally speaking, some level of stats to know that this is meaningful, real, important. So Ferris looking at the intersection of refugee and arts may be something that he talks about, these sorts of, the numbers behind the art industry, the numbers behind the refugee crisis. You'll see exactly. For now, you don't exactly know what it's going to be like, but you want to put in a lot of things so people can understand what those pieces are. So again, as you're writing this one, you're going to want to have the current state of it. Now, again, one of the things that people ask me oftentimes, Eric, is this sort of the order of introductions? Oftentimes it is. You can tweak it around. You'll see how it plays out a little bit. But generally speaking, this will be sort of roughly the order. All right. So the third one is what we would call I call this the problem, or why are you writing this one, right? The idea here is in some ways to sort of showcase these sort of two components here. It's sort of to show why you're compelled to write it and why there's a problem with this current state of the world. So, for example, to talk about Peyton a little bit, but he makes this bigger claim about the size of agriculture, yet there's all this hunger, we're not eating nutritiously, like there's all this diabetes and stuff like that. He's set the stage in these sorts of ways. And then what he's saying is that, like, listen, what we're doing today is not working. Let me show you why this is not working. There's like, we need to have a change. And in some ways, it's not only that we need to have a change, but I realize we need to have a change. So you want to identify the problem and connect you to that concept. So I'll give a quick story. There's a woman named Julia who wrote a book called Universal Housing. And she made the claim that with the rise of technology, most likely we're moving to a place where we're going to run out of, we're going to need to have universal basic income of some sort. There's not going to be full employment anymore. And so she comes to that case based on a whole bunch of data. She makes that claim. And then she makes the point saying that, like, people now are talking about this concept of universal basic income, which means basically people are going to be paid not to work. So if there's not a job for you, they'll just pay you money because, well, people need to have money, right? That's sort of the idea behind it. And she makes the concept to say, like, there's all these people testing this concept of, like, universal housing, or universal basic income. So, but that's not going to work. Like, you talk to people who are politicians, things like that, they're never going to go for that. And she's like, I realized that, like, we have to do something about it. So she tells her own story, realizing that when she saw a homeless person, and she was like, I didn't really want to give him money because I didn't know what he was going to spend it on. And so instead, I would have loved to be able to, like, help him have an apartment. And that's when the epiphany came for her. It's like, we don't need to, maybe rather than thinking about universal basic income, what if we could come with universal housing, right? Like, that is the premise behind it. So she makes this case to say, like, I see a problem and I can see the current state, but there's something wrong with that popular consensus that's flawed. It's insufficient. So I need to do it there. So Ferris and I were talking about his topic, right? This concept of, like, the refugee crisis, and this idea of, like, let's just give more money to, basically, to fund shelters and things like that. And he's going to try and make the case that, like, one of the ways that we could do this is if we supported art that was created by these communities and, like, pump some of that money in the refugee community to make impact. It will help all these sorts of ways to do it. So identify it, and, like, why does that matter to him? Tell that connection in that sort of way. So why are you doing this one, right? Like, in this case, this is the story a little bit of Catherine again about why this 10 ways up, getting more females to be CEOs. This book here is written for myself because, fewer companies are run by women. This is a true story. Fewer Fortune 500 companies are run by women than are run by men named John, right? Which is, like, the most depressing thing you'll ever hear, right? There's more CEOs named John than there are of Fortune 500 companies than there are women, which is the most fucked up thing you could ever hear, right? Like, what in the world is going on? And so she's like, I wanted to understand, like, how to even architect my career, how to do these sort of ones, because I didn't know how to do it. And there had to be a better way. So I had to go and learn from these people. I wanted to understand what it is, right? That's kind of the core thing for her. The problem, this is Cody's concept about, like, sort of the veteran world of, sort of enlisted people into becoming an employee. It's like the Veterans Administration puts a lot of energy into retirees and officers, but it doesn't put a lot into me. So I felt like everything was on me. That was the reason why this one. So there's the concept, the problem with it. Here's the sort of, like, how it connects to me. And this one, clearly, naps are the solution to billions in worker health premiums and billions in lost worker productivity. So he pours and says, like, I couldn't find an answer for these sorts of things. What I found in this research was compelling. And I realized that, like, I could bring this concept from my Asian American studies. Asians are embracing naps different than Americans, and maybe this thing fits together. So that was kind of why his concept here. And then lastly, in this case, was sort of this idea, the story here from Divine about the concept of sort of universal internet as this basic human right. And she tells this interesting story for her about her and another woman who both grew up in Rwanda, both with the last name of Mutoni. One who was basically, she had internet access, Divine did, her other friend didn't, and the differences in there. And that's when she realized, like, that was the single difference between the two of us. Excuse me. So that's kind of the premise here of the problem. And again, just to go back to what I mean by it is, you want to identify this popular consensus is flawed. There's something wrong with this, like, current state that you see, or the way that we're currently approaching it, and that you are tied into, like, it meant something to you, which is why you felt compelled to write it. Does that kind of make sense? These two pieces here, they're sort of two sides of the same coin, but I think the idea here is, like, something's wrong, and I found it was wrong, and I needed to do something about it. All right. So usually I would recommend to write both these ones. What's the problem that you see in this one? What's what was the problem you saw? And then how did this like made you recognize that you needed to write this book? You needed to make an impact in this one, right? Cody talks about he needed to write this because he had to figure it out on his own as a veteran. Divine figured it out because she saw a neighbor girl of hers growing up that didn't have the opportunities that Divine did as a a privileged person. And his studies in Asian American realized that like this was a problem for that like Asia was addressing, but the US wasn't in that sort of way. All right. So take just a couple minutes here and answer some of those specific questions. The why this is flawed, and then how your life kind of made this clear to you in that way. Now, just to sort of give you guys a quick picture of sort of what's coming, right? Remember, we have these sort of 7 pieces here. Next week, we're going to do sort of these sort of why you and what's your theory. And then the last one, we're going to do why read and stories and hooks in that one. So the core thing that I would just share for you guys as you think about these ones is sort of write bullet points and keep adding to them as you're writing your chapters. There's things that, as you dive into it, you may think, oh, interesting. Like that's kind of part of this, like, is you find yourself like writing sort of things that seems like something that's like, yeah, this probably applies to lots of places. Think about putting it in the current state, or if you're sort of like this personal story, I want to include it somewhere, maybe need to pull it forward. You'll find oftentimes that the introduction is one that the content may not always be in the right place. I'll tell a quick story of Haley. Haley is an author from Brown University. She wrote her book at her first draft and sent it to me. And the story that became the hook was actually buried in chapter 15. It was the best story in the whole thing. And I was like, dude, why are you hiding this one? She's like, well, it's a little embarrassing. It's a little personal. And so we pulled that one all the way forward. Now, and she was like kind of nervous about it because it didn't paint her in a perfectly great light all the way, but it was authentic. When Forbes magazine wrote a profile of her in her book, do you know what story they covered? That story. That was the story. So part of this is understanding that like this process of doing your introduction is going to be a bit collaborative. Do the best you can, be adding things as you go, bullet points, and then really what you're going to do is write just the best you can under an introduction in this way. And I'll give you some examples, but the most important thing is to make sure in your introduction you cover all 7 of these components. You want to cover them because if your book's missing them, your introduction will feel like it's missing. Don't worry if it's perfect right yet, but we'll cover these sort of pieces behind this front. So any quick questions on that at all? Otherwise, I will answer any other general questions in this case. I think Carson may walk through like, manuscript plans to make sure everyone has that sort of stuff nailed down. Otherwise, we'll kind of populate bullet points for the next few weeks as we go so that when you put together your introduction, great. But any general questions on what's ahead for the next 5 weeks or so, or any other things that I can answer with between now and then? Carson, anything from you?
Sorry, not really. Like honestly, thanks for coming, guys. I know that I will still go over manuscript plans. I know this is a weird timing thing. I had to rush over from a meeting. So, but yeah, I don't have any other questions. Do you guys?
Cool. All right. Well, Keep it up, guys. I know this pushes a slog a little bit, but remember, lower your expectations of what you're going to do. Get something across the line so that you can get feedback on it. But, keep doing your thing. We'll make this thing happen.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, no, I'm excited. See you, Eric.
All right, bye, guys.
So we'll keep this a little bit brief because I do have some stuff to do. I'm going to stop the recording now, too.